Have you ever watched someone's entire world crumble when they realized the golden goose they thought they owned was actually the one feeding them? When my husband of 42 years told me I was nothing but a worthless old woman who'd be living in a cardboard box without his support, I didn't argue or cry. I simply smiled, walked upstairs to my study, and with 3 phone calls, froze every single one of his accounts, canceled his credit cards, and had the locks changed on his precious vintage car collection. The look of sheer panic on his face, when his platinum card was declined at his exclusive country club, told me everything I needed to know about who was really worthless without whom. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Rose Whitfield, though everyone has called me Maggie for 7 decades. At 70 years old, I've learned that the most dangerous assumptions people make are about quiet women who smile politely and never make a fuss. For 42 years, I let my husband Charles believe he was the financial genius of our family, while I quietly built an empire he never even knew existed. Charles Whitfield was the kind of man who commanded attention the moment he walked into a room. At 73, he still carried himself with the arrogance of someone who had never been truly challenged, never been told no, never had to question whether his success was really his own. Tall, silver-haired, and impeccably dressed, he had the kind of old money confidence that made people assume he was important whether he actually was or not. We met in 1982 when I was 28 and he was 31. I was working as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm in downtown Charleston, South Carolina, living in a tiny apartment above a bakery and saving every penny I could. Charles was a junior partner at his family's law firm, driving a BMW and wearing suits that cost more than I made in 3 months. What drew me to Charles wasn't his money or status, it was his absolute certainty about everything. In a world where I constantly second-guessed myself, where I felt like I was always one mistake away from losing everything, Charles's confidence was intoxicating. He knew which wine to order, which restaurants were worth visiting, which people were worth knowing. He made decisions quickly and never seemed to doubt himself. More importantly, he seemed to see something in me that I didn't see in myself. "Maggie," he would say, taking my hand across restaurant tables I could never have afforded on my own. "You're brilliant with numbers, but you don't understand your own worth. Let me take care of the big picture while you handle the details." It seemed like a perfect partnership. Charles had the social connections and business acumen to succeed in Charleston's elite circles, while I had the analytical mind and attention to detail that could support his ambitions. What I didn't realize was that I was already building the foundation of something much larger than either of us imagined. The first 10 years of our marriage followed the script that Charles had written. He worked his way up to senior partner at Whitfield, Morrison & Associates, the law firm his grandfather had founded in 1923. I managed our household finances, organized his social calendar, and played the role of the supportive wife who made everything look effortless. But while Charles was networking at country club dinners and golf tournaments, I was discovering that I had a gift for seeing patterns that others missed. It started small, noticing that certain stocks always dipped before quarterly earnings reports, recognizing when real estate markets were about to shift, understanding how political changes would affect different industry sectors. Charles encouraged my interest in investing, as long as it stayed within what he considered appropriate boundaries. "It's wonderful that you enjoy playing with our household budget," he would say patronizingly. "Every good wife should understand domestic finances." What Charles didn't know was that my household budget management had quietly grown into something much more sophisticated. Using money I had saved from careful budgeting and small inheritance from my grandmother, I began making modest investments in companies I had researched extensively. I started with $5,000 in 1985, buying shares in a small technology company. That was developing something called personal computers. That investment returned 400% within 2 years. Instead of celebrating or telling Charles about my success, I reinvested the profits and began studying market patterns more seriously. I subscribed to financial publications under my maiden name, attended investment seminars in nearby cities when Charles traveled for business, and slowly built a knowledge base that most professional fund managers would have envied. The key to my success was invisibility. Charles never questioned bank statements because I handled all our financial paperwork. He never noticed additional income because I channeled everything through a separate account I had opened in my name only, using my maiden name and a post office box address. As far as he knew, our family's wealth came entirely from his law practice and the modest trust fund his parents had left him. By 1995, my household investment account had grown to $2.3 million. I had carefully diversified across technology stocks, real estate investment trusts, emerging market funds, and even some international currency trades that proved remarkably profitable. My investment strategy was built on patience, research, and the kind of long-term thinking that came naturally to someone who had grown up watching every penny. Charles, meanwhile, was living increasingly lavishly on what he believed was his own success. The law firm was doing well, but not nearly, as well as our lifestyle suggested. The difference was being quietly funded by my investment returns, channeled through our joint accounts in ways that made it appear to be coming from his business success. I paid for our mortgage upgrades, funded our elaborate vacation trips, and covered the costs of Charles's expensive hobbies: vintage car collecting, wine collecting, and membership in 3 different country clubs. When Charles wanted to buy his first classic Porsche for $150,000, I made sure the money was available, in our joint account. When he decided we needed a beach house in Kiowa Island, I quietly liquidated some investments to provide the down payment. Charles attributed our growing wealth to his brilliant legal career and smart financial management. He would frequently lecture friends and colleagues about the importance of disciplined saving and conservative investing. Advice that was ironic, considering he had never actually made a single investment decision in his life. The most dangerous part of my strategy was how easy it became to maintain the illusion. Charles was so convinced of his own financial acumen that he never questioned where money came from, only where it was going. When he wanted something expensive, he would simply announce his decision and assume the funds would be available. And, thanks to my careful management, they always were. "Maggie, I've decided to upgrade my office at the firm," he would say over breakfast. "I'm thinking about $75,000 for new furniture and technology." "That sounds wonderful, dear," I would reply, already calculating which investments I could liquidate to fund his desire for status symbols. This dynamic continued for decades, with Charles becoming more entitled and demanding while I became more skilled at generating the wealth that funded his lifestyle. He genuinely believed he was the financial genius of our family, while I was simply the dutiful wife who helped implement his brilliant strategies. The first signs of trouble came in 2018, when Charles was 70 and I was 67. He had been making increasingly grandiose statements about our financial security, claiming we were worth several $million, thanks to his prudent management and successful law practice. What he didn't know was that his law practice had actually been declining for years. Younger, more aggressive firms were taking market share, and Charles's old-fashioned approach was becoming less appealing to clients who wanted innovative legal strategies rather than traditional relationship management. I had been quietly compensating for the firm's declining income by increasing my investment activities. My portfolio had grown to $12.8 million by that point, generating enough passive income to maintain our lifestyle even if Charles's legal income disappeared entirely. But Charles was becoming increasingly anxious about maintaining appearances, and his anxiety was manifesting in disturbing ways. He began making comments about other women our age who had failed to keep up with the times, implying that their financial struggles were due to their own inadequacies rather than circumstances beyond their control. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Look at Patricia Henderson," he said one evening, referring to a widow in our social circle who had been forced to sell her home after her husband's death. If she had been smarter about money management, she wouldn't be living in that awful little condo now. Women of your generation just don't understand modern finance. The irony was breathtaking, but I held my tongue. Charles had no idea that women of my generation included someone who had outperformed most professional fund managers for 3 decades while he took credit for wealth he had never created. The comments became more frequent and more cutting. Charles would criticize women who worked outside the home as abandoning their family responsibilities, while simultaneously suggesting that women who didn't work were financial burdens on their husbands. According to his evolving worldview, women were supposed to be financially valuable, but never financially independent, supportive, but never competitive, grateful, but never demanding. The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 accelerated trends that had been building for years. Charles's law practice, which depended heavily on personal relationships and face-to-face meetings, struggled to adapt to remote work and digital communication. Younger firms that had already embraced technology thrived, while traditional practices, like Whitfield, Morrison & Associates found themselves increasingly irrelevant. Charles's income dropped by 60% in 2020, though he never admitted this to me directly. Instead, he began making cryptic comments about temporary market adjustments and strategic repositioning for long-term growth. What he was really doing was withdrawing money from our joint accounts to maintain his personal spending while assuming that our overall wealth would somehow remain stable. Meanwhile, my investment portfolio was thriving. The market volatility that terrified most investors created opportunities for someone with experience in pattern recognition and long-term thinking. I had positioned our investments to benefit from the technological acceleration that the pandemic created, and our actual net worth increased by 40%, while Charles believed we were struggling financially. The cognitive dissonance became almost surreal. Charles would complain about difficult economic times while planning expensive purchases, worry about our long-term financial security while booking luxury vacations, and lecture me about the importance of being more careful with money, while spending thousands of dollars on vintage wine that he would drink alone in his study. But the most revealing change was how he began talking about our relationship in financial terms. Charles started making comments about how fortunate I was to be taken care of by someone who understood money management, how women my age who lived alone were barely surviving on Social Security, and how I should be more grateful for the financial security he provided. "Maggie," he said one evening after drinking most of a $300 bottle of wine I had unknowingly paid for, "you need to understand that women your age without husbands are basically destitute. You're incredibly lucky that I've been smart enough to build the kind of wealth that can support both of us comfortably." I nodded and smiled, the same polite response I had been giving for 40 years. But something was crystallizing in my mind, a growing awareness that Charles genuinely believed his own fiction about being our family's financial provider. What Charles never discovered was the scope of what I had built during our decades of marriage. By 2023, my investment portfolio had grown to $18.7 million, spread across domestic and international stocks, real estate investments, precious metals, cryptocurrency, and even a few private equity positions in startup companies. My investment strategy had evolved far beyond simple stock picking. I had become skilled at identifying long-term trends before they became obvious to mainstream investors. I had invested in renewable energy companies in the 1990s, bought technology stocks during the dot-com crash when everyone else was selling, and moved into emerging markets just before they exploded in value. More importantly, I had learned to think globally about wealth building. While Charles focused on maintaining his status within Charleston's social hierarchy, I was building connections with investors and entrepreneurs around the world. I had partnerships with venture capital firms in Silicon Valley, real estate developers in Austin, renewable energy projects in Europe, and technology companies in Asia. My home office, which Charles assumed was just a place where I paid bills and organized household paperwork, was actually a sophisticated command center for managing a complex investment portfolio. I had multiple computer monitors, subscriptions to professional financial analysis services, and direct communication lines with fund managers and brokers in 6 different countries. The most satisfying part of my secret success was how consistently I had outperformed the professional fund managers that Charles occasionally suggested we hire to properly manage our wealth. While the S&P 500 had averaged about 10% annual returns over the past decade, my portfolio had averaged 18% annual returns through careful analysis, strategic timing, and the kind of patient long-term thinking that comes from building wealth, slowly over decades. But perhaps the most valuable skill I had developed was the ability to see economic patterns that others missed. I had predicted the 2008 financial crisis 18 months early and repositioned our investments to not only survive the crash, but profit from it. I had recognized the potential of cryptocurrency in 2012 and built a position that was now worth more than Charles's entire law practice. Most recently, I had identified the artificial intelligence boom 2 years before it became mainstream and invested accordingly. By our 40th wedding anniversary in 2022, our marriage had become a carefully choreographed performance where both of us were playing roles that had little to do with reality. Charles played the successful husband and financial provider, while I played the grateful wife who was fortunate to be taken care of by such a brilliant man. The irony was that Charles had become completely dependent on the wealth I was generating, while simultaneously becoming more dismissive of my intelligence and contributions. He lived in a bubble where his expensive lifestyle was evidence of his own success, where his ability to buy anything he wanted proved his financial brilliance, where his social status within Charleston's elite circles validated his belief in his own superiority. Meanwhile, I had become a financial powerhouse who was invisible in plain sight. I was managing investments that would have impressed professional fund managers, making economic predictions that were proving remarkably accurate, and building wealth at a pace that most people could only dream of. But because I did all of this, quietly, without seeking recognition or challenging Charles's narrative about himself, he remained completely unaware of what I had accomplished. The psychological dynamics of our relationship had become increasingly toxic. Charles's sense of self-worth was entirely tied to his belief that he was financially superior to me, while my actual financial superiority was hidden behind a facade of domestic submission. I was enabling his delusions while secretly building the power to destroy them. But the most dangerous aspect of our arrangement was how comfortable I had become with the deception. After decades of allowing Charles to take credit for wealth I had created, it felt normal to smile politely while he lectured me about money management. After years of channeling my investment profits through accounts that made them appear to be his income, it felt natural to let him believe in his own financial genius. Had become so skilled at being invisible that I had almost forgotten what it would feel like to be seen. The beginning of the end came in late 2023, when Charles made a decision that revealed just how little he actually understood about our financial situation. Without consulting me, he committed to a major renovation of our home that would cost $400,000, assuming that we could easily afford such an expense because of our substantial wealth. What Charles didn't realize was that our joint checking account, which he monitored occasionally, only contained about $50,000 at any given time. The real wealth, the $18.7 million investment portfolio, was completely separate from the accounts he had access to. When the renovation contractors requested their first payment of $100,000, Charles discovered that we didn't have the liquid cash he had assumed was available. His reaction was telling. Instead of questioning his own assumptions about our finances, Charles became angry with me for failing to properly manage our cash flow. Instead of acknowledging that he had made a major financial commitment without understanding our actual liquidity, he blamed me for not having anticipated his needs and prepared accordingly. "Maggie, this is exactly the kind of financial mismanagement that I'm always warning you about," he said, waving the contractor's invoice in my face. "You need to be more proactive about ensuring we have adequate cash reserves for important investments, like this renovation." I quietly transferred $150,000 from one of my investment accounts to our joint checking account, allowing Charles to pay the contractors and proceed with his renovation. But something had shifted in my perspective. For the first time in decades, I was seeing our relationship clearly, not as a partnership where I played a supporting role, but as a parasitic arrangement where Charles consumed wealth I created, while lecturing me about my supposed financial inadequacies. The renovation became a 6-month nightmare of Charles making increasingly expensive decisions while complaining about the cost, demanding premium materials while criticizing me for not finding better deals, and treating contractors with condescending arrogance while expecting me to manage all the actual logistics. But the final straw came during a dinner party we hosted to show off the renovated house to Charles's colleagues and their wives. As I served a meal, I had prepared myself, using ingredients I had paid for, in a kitchen I had funded. Charles regaled our guests with stories about his brilliant financial management and the sacrifices he had made to provide such a beautiful home for his simple wife. "The secret to financial success," Charles announced to the table, gesturing around our renovated dining room, "is understanding that someone has to make the hard decisions while someone else handles the simple tasks. Maggie takes care of the household details while I focus on the big picture. It's a division of labor that has served us very well." As I smiled politely and refilled wine glasses, I realized that I was done pretending. Charles had no idea that his world was about to crumble, and that the simple wife he had been patronizing for 42 years was about to teach him the most expensive lesson of his life. The morning after that dinner party marked a turning point I hadn't anticipated. As I cleared away crystal glasses and expensive china that Charles had insisted we needed for proper entertaining, I found myself calculating not just the cost of the evening, but the cost of 42 years of enabling his delusions. Charles was in his study, no doubt congratulating himself on another successful display of his supposed wealth and wisdom. From the kitchen, I could hear him on a phone call with his law partner, describing how impressed our guests had been with our beautiful home and his insights into wealth management. Every word was like a needle, but instead of pain, I felt something else entirely: clarity. I had spent 4 decades perfecting the art of being invisible, and now I was going to use that invisibility as a weapon. The first step was understanding exactly what Charles thought he knew about our finances. Over the next week, I began carefully questioning him about his perceptions of our wealth, our expenses, and our future financial plans. What I discovered was both infuriating and useful. Charles had created an elaborate fantasy about our financial situation that bore almost no resemblance to reality. In Charles's mind, we were worth approximately $3.2 million, most of which he attributed to his successful law practice, wise investment decisions he claimed to have made, and the appreciation of assets he believed he had purchased with his earnings. He had no idea that our actual net worth was closer to $19 million, and he certainly had no concept of where that wealth had actually originated. More importantly, Charles had developed specific theories about what would happen if our marriage ever ended. During one particularly revealing conversation, he explained to me why divorce was impossible, given our financial situation. "Maggie, you have to understand that everything we own is the result of my career and my financial decisions," he said, settling into his leather chair with the authoritative tone he used when explaining things to people he considered intellectually inferior. "If we were ever to separate, which is ridiculous to even consider, You would be entitled to maybe half of our assets. But without my income and my expertise managing those assets, your half would be worth much less over time." He continued with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged on his assumptions. "Women your age who live alone typically survive on Social Security and maybe a small pension. You've been fortunate to live a lifestyle that's far beyond what you could have achieved independently. The smart thing is to appreciate what you have and not rock the boat." I nodded thoughtfully, as if I were absorbing important financial wisdom, rather than listening to a man describe how he planned to keep me trapped in a marriage through economic intimidation. What Charles didn't know was that I had been living a secret professional life for over a decade. While he thought I spent my days managing household tasks and organizing social events, I had actually been working as an independent financial consultant for high-net-worth individuals who valued discretion and exceptional results. It had started in 2010 when Sarah Chen, a successful entrepreneur I had met at a charity fundraiser, mentioned her frustration with traditional wealth management firms. "They treat me like I don't understand my own money," she had complained. "They want to put everything in conservative mutual funds and charge enormous fees for advice I could get from reading financial magazines." I had listened to her concerns and, almost without thinking, started describing some of the investment strategies I had been using for our personal portfolio. Sarah's eyes had widened as I explained how I identified undervalued companies, predicted market trends, and managed risk across different asset classes. "Maggie, you're describing investment, approaches that most professional fund managers don't understand," Sarah had said. "Have you ever considered doing this professionally?" The idea had seemed impossible at first. How could I work as a financial consultant without Charles knowing? How could I build a client base while maintaining the fiction that I was just a housewife who handled domestic affairs? But Sarah had been persistent, and eventually I agreed to help her restructure her investment portfolio as a favor between friends. Within 6 months, her returns had improved by 340%, and she was referring other successful women who wanted the kind of personalized, sophisticated financial guidance that traditional firms weren't providing. My consulting practice had grown, entirely through word-of-mouth referrals, among a network of successful women who valued both exceptional results and absolute discretion. My clients included technology entrepreneurs, real estate developers, successful artists, and even a few inherited wealth individuals who had grown tired of patronizing advice from male fund managers. I met clients in coffee shops, private dining, rooms and hotel lobbies, always maintaining the appearance of social conversations rather than business meetings. I communicated through encrypted email accounts and handled all transactions through a complex network of shell companies and trust accounts that made my professional activities completely invisible to anyone who might be monitoring my personal finances. By 2023, I was managing $127 million in assets for 38 clients, generating both substantial fees for myself and extraordinary returns for the women who trusted me with their wealth. My average client was seeing annual returns of 22%, compared to the 8-12% they had been getting from traditional wealth management firms. But the most satisfying aspect of my secret practice was the relationships I had built with women who understood the value of financial independence. These were women who had built their own wealth, made their own decisions, and refused to accept anyone else's limitations on their potential. Through my consulting work, I had developed relationships with some of the most influential women in the Southeast. My client base included Dr. Vivian Martinez, who had built a chain of medical clinics across 3 states, Rebecca Thompson, who owned a portfolio of commercial real estate properties worth over $40 million, and Diana Foster, whose technology consulting firm had been acquired by a Fortune 500 company for $180 million. These women had taught me that real power in the modern economy belonged to people who understood how to create, preserve, and leverage wealth strategically. They had also taught me that the most dangerous mistake any woman could make was allowing someone else to control her financial destiny. During our monthly client meetings, which Charles assumed were ladies' lunch gatherings, I was actually receiving an education in advanced wealth management that would have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars at any elite business school. My clients shared strategies for international tax optimization, private equity investments, cryptocurrency portfolios, and even emerging opportunities in artificial intelligence and quantum computing. More importantly, they shared stories about how they had navigated relationships with men who tried to diminish their financial capabilities. Diana Foster had divorced a husband who claimed her business success was just luck and ended up proving that her lucky investment decisions continued to outperform his strategic portfolio for years after their separation. Rebecca Thompson had systematically documented how her ex-husband had taken credit for real estate investments she had researched, financed, and managed, ultimately winning a divorce settlement that reflected her actual contributions rather than his inflated sense of importance. These women had become my informal board of advisors, and their experiences had helped me understand that Charles's behavior was part of a predictable pattern. Men who built their self-worth on feeling financially superior to their wives often became increasingly controlling and dismissive over time, especially as they aged and their own earning power declined. But they had also taught me that the best defense against financial manipulation was overwhelming preparation. When you decide to act, Rebecca had told me during one of our meetings, you need to be so thoroughly prepared that your opponent doesn't have time to mount a counter-strategy. Financial warfare is won by whoever has the better intelligence and the more comprehensive plan. Throughout 2023, as Charles became increasingly condescending about money and more entitled about our lifestyle, I began building what I privately called my arsenal, a comprehensive collection of legal documents, financial records, and strategic assets that would give me overwhelming power in any future confrontation. The first component was complete documentation of every financial transaction in our marriage. Using forensic accounting techniques I had learned from my clients, I traced the source of every dollar that had funded our lifestyle over 4 decades. The results were stunning. Approximately 78% of our total wealth had originated from my investment activities, while Charles's law practice had contributed only 22%. More damaging to Charles's narrative was the pattern of his personal spending versus income generation. Over the past 5 years, Charles had spent an average of $340,000 annually on personal expenses, cars, wine, golf, travel, and entertainment, while his law practice had generated an average of only $180,000 per year in actual profit. The difference had been quietly subsidized by my investment returns, channeled through our joint accounts in ways that made Charles believe his spending was funded by his own success. I had detailed records showing that Charles's vintage Porsche collection, worth approximately $800,000, had been entirely funded by profits from my cryptocurrency investments. His wine cellar, valued at $250,000, had been purchased with returns from my renewable energy portfolio. Even his membership in the exclusive Ocean House Country Club, which cost $45,000 annually, was being paid from dividends generated by my technology stock holdings. The second component of my arsenal was legal preparation. Working with Catherine Fleming, a divorce attorney whose referral had come through my client network, I had quietly explored the legal implications of our financial arrangement. Catherine specialized in complex asset division cases involving successful women whose contributions had been systematically minimized by their husbands. Maggie, what you've documented is one of the most clear-cut cases of financial contribution versus recognition that I've ever seen, Catherine had told me during our confidential consultation. In South Carolina, marital property is divided based on several factors, including each spouse's contribution to the acquisition of assets. Your documentation would make it very difficult for Charles to claim that his earnings were the primary source of your wealth. But Catherine had also warned me about the psychological challenges I would face. Men like Charles often become desperate and vindictive when their financial control is threatened. You need to be prepared for him to make threats, spread lies about your mental capacity, or even try to hide assets that he believes belong to him. The key is maintaining absolute control over your own resources while limiting his ability to buy. Damage what you've built. By early 2024, I had quietly repositioned our assets in ways that would give me maximum leverage while appearing to maintain our normal financial arrangements. The strategy was inspired by military tactics my client Diana Foster had learned during her service as an Army officer. Control the high ground, secure your supply lines, and never let your opponent understand your true capabilities until you're ready to strike. I had systematically moved liquid assets into accounts that Charles couldn't access, while ensuring that enough money remained in our joint accounts to fund his normal spending patterns. To Charles, everything appeared normal. His credit cards worked, his checks cleared, and money was available whenever he decided to make a purchase. But the underlying structure had changed dramatically. Charles now had access to approximately $300,000 in joint accounts, enough to maintain his lifestyle for about 8 months if I completely cut off access to my investment returns. Meanwhile, I had secured $18.4 million in assets that were either in my name only or held through legal structures that Charles knew nothing about. More importantly, I had established financial relationships that would allow me to maintain my lifestyle indefinitely while Charles would be forced to live on his actual income from the law practice, approximately $180,000 per year, or less than half of his current annual spending. The psychological aspect of my preparation was equally important. I had spent months working with Dr. Amanda Ross, a therapist who specialized in helping women navigate complex relationship transitions. Dr. Ross had helped me understand that Charles's increasing aggression about money was likely a response to his subconscious awareness that his control was slipping, even though he couldn't consciously identify why he felt threatened. Financial abuse often escalates when the abuser senses that their victim is becoming more independent, Dr. Ross had explained. Charles's comments about your supposed financial incompetence are probably getting more frequent and more harsh, because some part of him recognizes that you're not as dependent as you used to be. Dr. Ross had also helped me prepare for the emotional manipulation that would inevitably come when Charles realized his financial control was slipping. He'll try to make you feel guilty about disrupting the life you've built together, scared about your ability to survive independently, and confused about what you've actually contributed to the relationship. The key is remembering what you know to be true, regardless of what he tries to make you believe. As winter turned to spring in 2024, Charles's behavior became increasingly erratic and hostile. His law practice was struggling more than ever. Younger, more technologically sophisticated firms were capturing most of the high-value clients, while Charles's old-fashioned approach was becoming less relevant each year. But instead of acknowledging the reality of his professional decline, Charles doubled down on his belief in his own financial superiority. He began making pronouncements about our future that revealed just how divorced from reality his thinking had become. "Maggie, I've been thinking about our retirement planning," he announced one evening over dinner. "Given my excellent management of our investments over the years, I think we're in a position where I could fully retire from the law practice and focus on managing our portfolio full-time." The irony was breathtaking. Charles wanted to retire from the work that generated his only actual income so he could focus on managing investments that he had never made and wealth that he had never created. "Of course, you would need to be more careful about household expenses," he continued. "When someone retires from active income generation, it becomes even more important to avoid unnecessary spending on things like your shopping trips and salon visits." I had been funding Charles's lifestyle for decades, and now he was suggesting that I needed to reduce my own modest personal expenses so he could retire to full-time wealth management of assets he didn't know existed. But the most revealing moment came when Charles decided to lecture me about the importance of financial gratitude during one of his increasingly frequent wine-fueled monologues. "Maggie, you need to understand how fortunate you are," he said, swirling a glass of $400 wine that I had unknowingly purchased. Most women your age are struggling to pay for basic necessities. They're living in small apartments, driving old cars, worrying about medical bills. You live in a beautiful home, travel whenever you want, and never have to think about money because I've made smart decisions for 40 years. He paused dramatically, apparently expecting gratitude for his supposed generosity. The least you could do is show some appreciation for the security I've provided, instead of taking it for granted. I smiled and nodded, the same polite response I had been giving for decades. But inside, I was calculating exactly how much Charles's security had actually cost me over the years, and planning how I was going to collect on that debt. By May 2024, I had completed what Catherine Fleming called the most thorough pre-divorce preparation she had ever seen. Every asset was documented, every legal vulnerability was addressed, and every strategic advantage was secured. I had also made a decision that would have seemed impossible to me just a year earlier. I was going to destroy Charles's entire understanding of reality in a single, devastating confrontation. Not because I wanted to hurt him, but because 42 years of his condescending lectures about money and my supposed incompetence had earned him a masterclass in exactly how wrong he had been. About everything. The trigger would be his next attempt to lecture me about financial responsibility. Based on his patterns, it would come soon, probably during another dinner party where he could perform his expertise for an audience, or during one of his increasingly frequent complaints about household expenses. When that moment came, I would be ready with 3 simple phone calls that would show Charles exactly what it felt like to be financially worthless. The first call would freeze all the accounts that funded his lifestyle. The second would change the locks on the garage that housed his precious vintage car collection. The third would inform him that the simple wife he had been patronizing for 4 decades was actually worth more money than he had ever imagined, and that every luxury he had enjoyed was about to disappear. Charles had spent 42 years teaching me to be invisible. Now I was going to teach him what it felt like to watch his entire world disappear. What I hadn't anticipated was how liberating it would feel to prepare for this confrontation. For decades, I had carried the psychological burden of maintaining Charles's illusions while suppressing my own sense of accomplishment and pride. The effort required to appear financially dependent while actually being financially dominant had been exhausting in ways I hadn't fully understood. Working with Dr. Ross had helped me recognize that I had been living in a state of constant cognitive dissonance, where my external reality bore no resemblance to my internal experience. "You've been gaslighting yourself," she had told me during one of our sessions. "You've become so skilled at enabling Charles's false beliefs about himself that you've started to question your own perceptions of your capabilities." The preparation process had reversed that dynamic. Instead of hiding my competence, I was documenting it. Instead of minimizing my contributions, I was quantifying them. Instead of enabling Charles's delusions, I was preparing to shatter them, completely. I had also begun to understand the broader social dynamics that had allowed our dysfunctional financial relationship to persist for so long. Charleston's elite social circles were full of couples where successful men took credit for wealth that had actually been generated by their wives' family money, investment skills, or business acumen. The social expectation was that women would graciously allow their husbands to appear to be the financial leaders, regardless of who was actually making the important decisions. But I was done participating in that charade. Charles was about to learn that the days of taking credit for my success while lecturing me about my limitations were over. The only question remaining was when he would provide me with the perfect opportunity to demonstrate exactly how wrong he had been about everything. The opportunity I had been waiting for arrived on a humid Tuesday evening in June 2024, during what should have been a celebration. Charles had just closed a case that he considered his greatest professional triumph, a contract dispute that had netted the firm $180,000 in fees, which represented nearly his entire annual contribution to our household income. He had invited his law partners, Richard Morrison and David Hayes, along with their wives, to celebrate what he was calling one of the most significant legal victories in Charleston business history. As I prepared dinner for 8 people, using ingredients that cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month, Charles regaled his guests with increasingly embellished stories about his brilliant legal strategy and natural courtroom presence. The key to success in law, as in all business, Charles announced, raising a glass of 1998 Chateau Margaux that I had purchased for $800, is understanding that every situation requires leadership from someone who can see the big picture. While others get lost in details, true leaders focus on strategy and vision. His partner, Richard, who had actually handled most of the courtroom work on the case, smiled politely while his wife Patricia rolled her eyes slightly. David Hayes looked uncomfortable, probably because he knew that Charles's brilliant strategy had actually been developed by their junior associate, Linda Martinez, whose ideas Charles had appropriated with his usual casual arrogance. But it was Charles's next pronouncement that provided me with the perfect opening I had been waiting for. "Speaking of leadership and vision," Charles continued, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he used when he wanted to demonstrate his wisdom to a captive audience, "I've been thinking about how fortunate we all are to have wives who understand their roles in supporting our success. Too many modern women make the mistake of thinking they should compete with their husbands instead of complementing them." He gestured toward me as I served the main course, a gesture that felt simultaneously possessive and dismissive. "Maggie here is the perfect example of how a marriage should work. She handles all the domestic details so I can focus on building our wealth and maintaining our lifestyle. It's a division of labor that has served us very well for 42 years. Patricia Morrison, who had been listening with growing irritation, couldn't resist challenging Charles's pronouncement. "That's an interesting perspective, Charles. But don't you think women today are capable of contributing more than just domestic support? I mean, there are plenty of women building successful businesses and managing complex investments." Charles's response revealed everything I needed to know about how he viewed both me and women in general. "Of course, women can handle simple business tasks," he said with the condescending patience of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "But the kind of strategic thinking required for serious wealth building? That requires a different kind of analytical capability." He turned to look directly at me, his expression a mixture of affection and pity. "Maggie is wonderful at managing household finances and keeping track of our day-to-day expenses. But if I died tomorrow, she would be completely lost when it came to managing our investment portfolio or making the kind of complex financial decisions that have built our wealth over the years." The silence that followed was electric. Patricia Morrison looked stunned by the casual cruelty of Charles's assessment. Richard and David appeared deeply uncomfortable, probably recognizing that Charles had crossed a line from general pontificating into personal humiliation. But I felt something entirely different, a crystalline clarity that told me this was the moment I had been preparing for. Charles had just publicly declared that I was financially incompetent and completely dependent on his expertise. In front of witnesses who would remember every word, he had positioned himself as the sole architect of our wealth and me as a grateful beneficiary of his brilliance. It was time to show him exactly how wrong he was about everything. I set down the serving platter with deliberate calm and reached for my phone, which I had positioned strategically next to my place setting. "Charles, that's such an interesting perspective," I said, my voice steady and pleasant. "I think our guests might be fascinated to learn some details about our actual financial arrangements." Charles looked puzzled but pleased, apparently assuming I was about to provide supporting evidence for his theories about marital division of labor. "Of course, dear. I'm sure everyone would appreciate understanding how successful financial partnerships actually work." I opened my phone and pulled up the banking app for our primary joint checking account, the one that Charles monitored and considered representative of our overall wealth. "Let's start with something simple," I said, turning the screen so our guests could see the account balance. "Charles, Could you tell everyone how much money you think we have in our main checking account? Charles glanced at the phone screen and smiled confidently. We typically maintain about $45,000 to $50,000 in checking for monthly expenses, he said. The real wealth is in our investment accounts and retirement funds, which I manage separately. That's exactly right, I confirmed. Our checking account currently shows $47,830. I made my first call, speed dialing a number I had programmed months earlier. Hello, this is Margaret Whitfield. I need to transfer $45,000 from savings account ending in 7394 to checking account ending in 2156. Yes, immediately. Thank you. Within 30 seconds, our joint checking account balance jumped from $47,832 to $92,832. Charles looked confused but not alarmed. A $45,000 transfer from savings seemed reasonable, even if he didn't remember authorizing it. Now, Charles, I continued, since you've been managing our investments so brilliantly, I'm sure you can tell our guests about our largest asset holdings. What would you say is our most valuable investment category? Charles straightened in his chair, clearly enjoying the opportunity to demonstrate his financial expertise. Our real estate holdings are obviously significant. This house, the beach property, some commercial real estate I've invested in over the years. I'd estimate our real estate portfolio at about $2.8 million. Then we have our stock market investments, which I've built up to approximately $800,000 through careful analysis and strategic timing. I nodded thoughtfully. Those are impressive numbers. And you mentioned that if something happened to you, I would be helpless to manage these complex investments because I lack the analytical capabilities for serious wealth building? Well, not helpless. Charles backtracked slightly, apparently sensing that he might have been too harsh in front of company. But managing a multi-million-dollar portfolio requires experience and expertise that takes years to develop. Most people, especially women who haven't worked in finance, would be wise to hire professional fund managers rather than trying to handle complex investments themselves. Patricia Morrison looked like she wanted to interrupt, but I held up a gentle hand. That's such valuable advice, Charles. I'm sure our guests would be interested to see how someone with professional-level investment expertise manages a complex portfolio. Would you mind pulling up your investment accounts so everyone can see what brilliant financial management actually looks like? Charles hesitated for just a moment, probably realizing that his investment accounts weren't quite as impressive as his dinner party boasting suggested, but he was trapped by his own arrogance and the expectation he had created that he would be happy to demonstrate his financial brilliance. Of course, he said, reaching for his phone, though I should mention that I don't keep our entire portfolio in easily accessible accounts. Much of our wealth is in long-term investments that require more sophisticated platforms. Charles spent several minutes pulling up his various financial accounts while I smiled politely and refilled wine glasses. What our guests were seeing, though Charles didn't realize it yet, was a man desperately trying to find evidence of the wealth he had been claiming to manage. His investment accounts, when he finally displayed them, showed a total value of approximately $340,000. Respectable for most people, but nowhere near the millions he had been implying he controlled. His retirement accounts added another $180,000. Even including his estimate of our real estate equity, Charles was looking at assets totaling perhaps $1.2 million. Comfortable, but hardly the multi-million-dollar portfolio he had been describing. This is excellent, Charles, I said, making careful notes on a piece of paper. So, if I'm understanding correctly, you're currently managing about $520,000 in liquid investments, plus our real estate holdings. And you've achieved this through years of analytical expertise that someone like me could never replicate. Exactly, Charles said, though he looked slightly deflated by the reality of seeing his actual account balances displayed for critical examination. Building wealth is about consistent, disciplined decision-making over decades. It's not something you can improvise or handle casually. I made my second phone call, this time to Catherine Fleming, my divorce attorney, who I knew would be waiting by her phone. "Catherine, this is Maggie. Could you please email me the executive summary we prepared?" "Yes, the one with the asset documentation. I need it immediately." I hung up and turned back to our guests. "I've asked my attorney to send over some documents that might add some interesting context to our discussion about financial management." Charles went pale. "Your attorney? Maggie, what are you talking about? Why would you have an attorney?" "Oh, I've been working with Catherine Fleming on some estate planning matters," I said casually. "Given your concerns about my ability to manage complex finances, if something happened to you, I thought it would be wise to get professional advice about wealth preservation strategies." My phone chimed with Catherine's email, and I opened the attachment, a beautifully formatted legal document titled Financial Contribution Analysis, Whitfield Marital Assets, 1982-2024. I had spent months working with Catherine to prepare this summary, which laid out 42 years of financial activity with the precision of a forensic audit. "This is so interesting," I said, beginning to read from the document. "According to this analysis, our total marital assets are valued at approximately $19.3 million, which is quite a bit more than the numbers you just shared with everyone." The silence around the table was deafening. Charles looked like he had been punched in the stomach. "19 million?" he whispered. "That's impossible. Our net worth is maybe 3 million, and that's being generous." I continued reading from Catherine's summary. The analysis shows that 81.7% of our total wealth originated from investment activities conducted by Margaret Whitfield, using separately managed accounts and independent research. Charles Whitfield's law practice contributed 18.3% of total marital assets primarily during the period from 1985 to 2010. Patricia Morrison's wine glass paused halfway to her lips. Richard and David exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something far more dramatic than a typical dinner party conversation. Charles struggled to find his voice. "Maggie, I don't understand what this document is supposed to mean. Are you saying you've been hiding money from me?" "Not hiding," I corrected gently. "Managing. The same way you've been managing our household finances, except I've been doing it for our investment portfolio." I turned back to Catherine's summary. "For example, your vintage Porsche collection, valued at $847,000, was purchased entirely, with profits from cryptocurrency investments I made between 2015 and 2022. Your wine cellar, worth approximately $280,000, was funded by dividends from renewable energy stocks I bought in 2018. I could see Charles trying to process this information, but his worldview was crumbling too quickly for him to mount any coherent response. "Even your membership at Ocean House Country Club," I continued, "has been paid for the past 8 years using returns from my technology stock portfolio." David Hayes, who had been silent throughout the conversation, finally spoke up. "Maggie, are you saying that you've been managing investments worth nearly $20 million while Charles thought he was handling your finances?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," I replied. "I've been working as an independent financial consultant for the past 14 years, managing portfolios for 38 clients with a total asset value of $127 million. My average annual returns have been 22%, compared to the market average of about 10%. Charles looked like he was going to be sick. "This is insane. You're talking about millions of dollars that I've never seen, investment accounts I've never heard of, and some kind of secret business that I know nothing about. How is any of this possible?" I made my third and final phone call, this time to my bank's private wealth management division. "This is Margaret Whitfield, account number 7749GX. I need to implement the account restriction protocol we discussed." "Yes, all joint accounts, effective immediately. Thank you." I hung up and smiled at Charles with the same polite expression I had been wearing for 42 years. The account restriction protocol means that all of our joint accounts now require dual authorization for any withdrawals over $500. Since you've just spent the evening explaining to everyone how financially incompetent I am, I thought it would be wise to implement some safeguards. Charles tried to stand up, his face flushed with anger and confusion. You can't do this. You can't just freeze our accounts and make up stories about secret millions of dollars. This is our money, and I'm the one who's been managing it for our entire marriage. Actually, I said, pulling up another document on my phone. According to South Carolina marital property law, assets acquired during marriage are generally considered joint property, but they're divided based on several factors, including each spouse's contribution to their acquisition. Catherine thinks I have a very strong case for claiming about 85% of our total assets, given the documentation I've provided. The psychological impact on Charles was immediate and devastating. In front of his law partners and their wives, the man who had just finished lecturing everyone about financial leadership and male superiority had been revealed as someone who had been unknowingly dependent on his wife's financial genius for decades. Patricia Morrison was the first to break the stunned silence. Maggie, you're telling us that you've been secretly managing nearly $20 million while Charles thought he was the financial expert in your family? Secret is probably the wrong word, I replied. Discreet would be more accurate. Charles never asked about my daily activities, so I never felt obligated to provide detailed reports about my investment research and client consultations. Richard. Morrison looked at Charles with something approaching pity. Charles, did you really have no idea that Maggie was working as a financial consultant? Charles was struggling to maintain any semblance of dignity. This is ridiculous. Maggie doesn't have the background or expertise to manage complex investments. She's never worked in finance, never studied economics, never shown any interest in sophisticated financial strategies. I opened my laptop, which I had strategically placed on the sideboard earlier in the evening. Would you like to see my client portfolio performance over the past 5 years? Or perhaps my analysis of emerging market trends that I presented at the International Women's Investment Conference in Dubai last month? Charles stared at the laptop screen, which displayed a sophisticated financial dashboard showing real-time portfolio performance across multiple asset classes and international markets. Dubai? He whispered. You went to Dubai last month? You told me you were visiting your sister in Atlanta. I did visit Sarah in Atlanta, I confirmed, but I also attended the conference, where I was one of the keynote speakers. The topic was Invisible Wealth, How Traditional Gender Assumptions Mask Female Financial Leadership. It was very well received. David Hayes shook his head in amazement. Maggie, how long have you been doing this kind of work? Professionally? About 14 years. But I've been managing my own investments for nearly 40 years. Charles has been living off the returns from my portfolio for so long that I don't think he remembers what it feels like to support himself financially. The cruelest part of the revelation was how it recontextualized every conversation Charles had ever had about money, success, and gender roles. Every lecture he had given about female financial incompetence, every patronizing comment about women who couldn't handle complex decisions, every assumption he had made about his own superiority, all of it had been funded by the intelligence and expertise of the woman he had been condescending to for 4 decades. Charles made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative. Even if this is all true, he said, his voice shaking with anger and humiliation, you've been deceiving me for our entire marriage. You've been living a lie, pretending to be someone you're not, manipulating our finances behind my back. I considered his accusation carefully, then responded with the kind of calm analytical thinking that had made me successful in both investing and marriage management. Charles, I've been exactly who I've always been, someone who's excellent at analyzing complex situations and making strategic decisions. The only thing I've been pretending is that you were the one making those decisions. Patricia Morrison's expression had shifted from surprise to something approaching admiration. Maggie, this is incredible. You've essentially been supporting Charles's entire lifestyle while letting him believe he was supporting you. It seemed like the kind thing to do, I replied. Charles derived so much pleasure from feeling financially superior that I didn't want to damage his self-esteem by correcting his misconceptions. But after 42 years of listening to lectures about my supposed financial limitations, I thought it might be time for a more honest conversation. Charles stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. This conversation is over. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, Maggie, but our guests don't need to be subjected to this ridiculous fantasy. I remained seated, my voice still pleasant and conversational. You're absolutely right that our guests shouldn't be subjected to uncomfortable revelations. But since you spent the evening explaining to everyone how financially helpless I would be without your expertise, I thought they might be interested to learn that you'll be finding out exactly how financially helpless you are without mine. Charles tried to storm out of the dining room, but I called after him with one final observation. Oh, and Charles, your credit cards have all been canceled. I called the companies this afternoon and explained that there had been some confusion about account authorization. Apparently, when someone has been making the payments on accounts for 42 years, the credit card companies are quite willing to listen to their concerns about unauthorized usage. The sound of Charles frantically dialing his phone could be heard from the hallway as he tried to reach his bank, his credit card companies, and anyone else who might be able to restore his access to the money he had never realized wasn't his. But the most satisfying sound was the silence from our dinner guests, who were beginning to understand that they had just witnessed one of the most thorough destructions of male financial arrogance in Charleston's social history. The 70-year-old woman who had been dismissed as financially incompetent had just proven that she was not only more financially sophisticated than her husband, but more financially sophisticated than most professional fund managers. And Charles's world would never be the same. I woke up at 5:30 a.m. the next morning to the sound of Charles frantically making phone calls from his study. Through our bedroom wall, I could hear fragments of increasingly desperate conversations with bank representatives, credit card companies, and what sounded like a crisis management consultant. His voice carried the particular strain of someone who had spent the night discovering that his entire understanding of reality had been completely wrong. The guest bedroom door had been locked when I went upstairs after our dinner guests left in stunned silence. Charles had apparently barricaded himself inside, probably spending the night researching divorce lawyers, forensic accountants, and anyone else who might be able to help him understand how his financially incompetent wife had somehow accumulated nearly $20 million without his knowledge. I made coffee in our kitchen, my kitchen, I corrected myself, and reviewed the messages that had accumulated on my phone overnight. Catherine Fleming had sent a detailed timeline for the next phase of our strategy. Dr. Amanda Ross had forwarded several articles about financial abuse recovery that she thought might be helpful. Most surprisingly, I had received text messages from Patricia Morrison and David Hayes' wife Linda, both expressing support and asking if I needed anything. But the most significant development was an email from my client network. Word about the previous evening's revelation had apparently spread through Charleston's elite women faster than wildfire, and the response was overwhelmingly positive. Diana Foster had forwarded an article about high-profile divorce cases involving hidden assets, noting that my documentation would make me a case study in proper financial preparation. Rebecca Thompson had sent contact information for 3 additional divorce attorneys who specialized in complex asset division. Even Sarah Chen, my original client, had reached out to offer personal security recommendations if Charles became hostile. What struck me most was the tone of these messages. These successful, sophisticated women weren't surprised by my revelation. They were impressed by how thoroughly I had prepared for it. In their world, financial independence and strategic thinking were expected qualities, not shocking discoveries. The contrast with Charles's reaction couldn't have been more stark. While my professional network was treating my financial success as impressive but unsurprising, Charles was apparently treating it as some kind of elaborate fraud that needed to be investigated and exposed. Around 8 a.m., Charles emerged from his makeshift bunker looking like he hadn't slept. His usually perfect silver hair was disheveled, his expensive silk pajamas wrinkled, and his face had the gray pallor of someone who had spent the night staring into an abyss of financial reality. "Maggie, we need to talk," he said, settling into his usual seat at our breakfast table with the careful movements of someone trying to maintain dignity while his world collapsed around him. I poured him coffee and waited for what I suspected would be the opening move in his counterattack strategy. Charles was many things, but he wasn't passive. After the initial shock wore off, he would inevitably try to regain control of the situation through whatever means necessary. "I've been thinking about what happened last night," he began, his voice carefully controlled. "And I think there are some serious legal and ethical questions that need to be addressed before this situation goes any further." I sipped my coffee and maintained the pleasant expression that had served me so well for 4 decades. "What kind of questions, Charles?" "Well, for starters, you've apparently been operating some kind of business without my knowledge, using what might be marital assets, and potentially creating tax liabilities that could affect both of us. I've scheduled meetings with our accountant, our attorney, and a forensic investigator to review exactly what you've been doing and whether any laws have been broken." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Charles was suggesting that my investment activities might be fraudulent or illegal, and that he was prepared to use official investigations to challenge my claims about our finances. I had been expecting this response. Men like Charles didn't surrender power gracefully, and when their control was threatened, they often became desperate and vindictive. Catherine Fleming had warned me that Charles would likely try to portray me as either mentally incompetent or criminally deceptive, depending on which narrative seemed more likely to restore his financial control. "That sounds very thorough," I replied. "I'm sure our professionals will be fascinated to review my documentation. In fact, I think they'll find my record-keeping quite impressive." Charles's confidence flickered slightly, but he pressed forward with his prepared talking points. "Maggie, I need you to understand the seriousness of this situation. If you've been hiding assets or operating undisclosed business activities, there could be significant legal consequences. The smart thing would be to work with me to resolve these issues quietly before they become public problems that could damage both of our reputations." The implicit offer was clear: restore his financial access and social dignity, and he wouldn't pursue legal action that might embarrass both of us. It was exactly the kind of negotiation tactic that had probably worked for him throughout his legal career: threaten severe consequences while offering a face-saving compromise. But Charles had fundamentally misunderstood his position. He was operating from the assumption that I had something to hide, some vulnerability that would make me eager to avoid scrutiny. What he didn't realize was that I had been preparing for exactly this kind of investigation for months, and that my documentation would not only prove the legitimacy of my activities, but also reveal the full extent of his financial dependence. "I think that's an excellent idea," I said, standing up to refill my coffee. "Why don't you call our accountant right now and schedule that review? I'd love to walk him through my investment strategies and show him how I've been generating the income that's funded your lifestyle for the past decade." Charles's first meeting was with Martin Brewster, the CPA who had been handling our tax returns for 15 years. Martin was a meticulous professional who Charles respected and trusted, which made him the perfect person to validate or debunk my claims about our financial arrangement. I had called Martin the night before to give him advance warning about Charles's likely accusations and to offer full access to my financial records. Martin had been intrigued rather than alarmed, noting that my tax filings had always been impeccably documented and that my reported investment income had seemed remarkably consistent over the years. "Mrs. Whitfield," Martin had said during our phone conversation, "I've actually been curious about your investment strategies for some time. Your portfolio performance has been exceptional, and your tax planning has been quite sophisticated. I'd be happy to review everything with Mr. Whitfield. The meeting took place in Martin's downtown office, in a conference room overlooking Charleston Harbor. Charles arrived with a briefcase full of bank statements and a legal pad covered with questions. He planned to ask about my supposed financial irregularities. I arrived with Catherine Fleming and 3 boxes of meticulously organized financial documentation. Martin began by reviewing our joint tax returns for the previous 5 years, walking Charles through the sources of our reported income. What emerged was a pattern that Charles had apparently never noticed. Approximately 75% of our annual income came from investment returns, capital gains, and consulting fees reported under my name and Social Security number. Mr. Whitfield, Martin said, spreading out the tax documents across the conference table. According to these returns, your law practice has generated an average of $180,000 annually over the past 5 years, while Mrs. Whitfield's investment and consulting activities have generated an average of $520,000 annually. Charles stared at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language. That can't be right. Our investment income comes from portfolios that I manage. Maggie just handles the household checking account. Martin pulled up his computer, records, and displayed a detailed breakdown of our income sources. Actually, all of the investment income is reported under Mrs. Whitfield's Social Security number, from accounts that are in her name only. Your reported income comes exclusively from the law firm, plus a small amount of interest from the joint savings account. Catherine Fleming leaned forward with the expression of someone who was about to deliver devastating news with professional courtesy. Martin, could you help us understand the tax implications if Mr. and Mrs. Whitfield were to divorce? Specifically, how would their individual tax situations change? Martin calculated quickly, then looked up with obvious surprise. Well, Mrs. Whitfield would continue reporting the same investment and consulting income, so her tax situation would remain essentially unchanged. But Mr. Whitfield would be limited to his law practice income, which would put him in a much lower tax bracket. The implications were stark. Charles had been living a lifestyle that required approximately $340,000 in annual after-tax income, while his law practice generated only $180,000 before taxes. Without access to my investment returns, he would need to reduce his expenses by roughly 60% just to break even. While Charles was struggling to understand the professional implications of our financial reality, a different battle was emerging in Charleston's social circles. Word about our dinner party confrontation had spread through the community like a particularly juicy piece of gossip, but the narrative was not developing in ways that Charles had expected. In traditional Charleston society, a wife publicly humiliating her husband would typically be viewed as a social transgression that reflected poorly on her character and upbringing. But the specific nature of my revelation, that I had been secretly supporting Charles's lifestyle while he patronized me about financial incompetence, had struck a nerve with many women who had experienced similar dynamics in their own marriages. Diana, Foster called me that afternoon with a fascinating update about social media discussions among Charleston's elite women. Maggie, you've become a folk hero overnight, she said, barely containing her amusement. There are women sharing stories about their own husbands who take credit for wealth that actually comes from family trusts, inheritance, or their wives' business activities. Apparently, my public revelation had inspired other women to examine their own financial relationships more critically. Patricia Morrison had posted a lengthy Facebook essay about invisible contributions in marriage, noting that many women were expected to manage complex household finances, while their husbands received credit for providing the lifestyle that both spouses' efforts had created. Even more damaging to Charles's reputation, several women had shared their own stories about his condescending comments over the years. Rebecca Thompson had posted about a country club conversation where Charles had lectured her about the importance of letting men handle serious financial decisions. Linda Hayes had described a dinner party where Charles had suggested that women who worked outside the home were neglecting their primary responsibilities. The cumulative effect was devastating. Instead of being viewed as a woman who had inappropriately challenged her husband's authority, I was being seen as someone who had finally stood up to decades of financial gaslighting. Charles, meanwhile, was being characterized as a pompous fraud who had built his social status on wealth he had never created. But the most brilliant aspect of the social media response was how it reframed the narrative around expertise and competence. Instead of focusing on marital conflict, women were discussing investment strategies, business development, and financial independence. My consulting practice was being described as an impressive professional achievement, not a shocking betrayal of marital trust. Charles's attempt to control the story through social disapproval had backfired spectacularly. Instead of isolating me, the revelation had connected me with a community of women who understood exactly what I had been experiencing and were eager to celebrate my successful liberation. Charles's second meeting was with James Blackstone, a divorce attorney known for representing wealthy men who wanted to minimize their financial exposure during marital dissolution. Blackstone specialized in challenging asset valuations, questioning income sources, and finding technical loopholes that could protect his clients' wealth from equitable distribution. I knew about this meeting because Catherine Fleming had contacts throughout Charleston's legal community, and because Charles had made the appointment using our joint credit card, which I now controlled. The irony of Charles paying for divorce advice with money he didn't realize was mine was not lost on either Catherine or me. Blackstone's strategy, according to Catherine's sources, was to challenge the legitimacy of my investment activities and business income. He planned to argue that my consulting practice was actually a hobby that generated inflated income claims, that my investment portfolio included hidden marital assets, and that my financial documentation was designed to exaggerate my contributions while minimizing Charles's. But Blackstone had made the same mistake that Charles consistently made. He had underestimated the thoroughness of my preparation and the sophistication of my legal strategy. Catherine had spent months preparing for exactly this kind of challenge. Every investment transaction was documented with bank records, brokerage statements, and tax filings that established clear chains of ownership. Every consulting fee was supported by detailed contracts, client communications, and work product documentation. Every asset transfer was traced through legal channels that proved the source of funds and the legitimacy of ownership claims. More importantly, Catherine had evidence that Charles's own lifestyle had been funded by my income for years, making it impossible for him to claim that my assets were somehow illegitimate. His Porsche collection, wine cellar, country club memberships, and luxury vacations had all been purchased with traceable proceeds from my investment activities. The legal challenge that was supposed to expose my financial fraud would instead document the extent to which Charles had been living as a kept man while believing himself to be a financial provider. By the end of the week, Charles's confidence in his legal and social strategy was clearly shaken. His meetings with our accountant and his divorce attorney had confirmed rather than challenged my financial claims, and the social media narrative was painting him as a privileged fraud rather than a wronged husband. His response was to escalate his tactics in increasingly desperate ways. First, he attempted to assert physical control over our shared assets. I came home from a client meeting to find that Charles had changed the locks on his garage, where he kept his vintage car collection. He had also hired a security company to install new locks on his study, claiming that he needed to protect sensitive legal documents from unauthorized access. The irony was that Charles was trying to secure assets that I had purchased in a home that I owned, using security services that would be billed to accounts that I controlled. Catherine Fleming found the situation amusing enough to document extensively for potential use in divorce proceedings. Second, Charles began spreading a counter-narrative among his professional contacts, claiming that I was suffering from some kind of late-life psychological crisis that had led me to create elaborate fantasies about financial success. He suggested to his law partners that I might be experiencing early-stage dementia, which explained my confusion about our family finances. This strategy backfired when Richard Morrison called me directly to express concern about Charles's mental state. "Maggie, I've known you for 20 years, and you've always been sharp as a tack," Richard said. "Charles is claiming you're having memory problems, but you seemed perfectly lucid when you walked us through those financial documents. Is Charles okay? He seems to be having trouble accepting reality." Third, Charles attempted to regain control of our joint accounts by claiming that I was financially abusing him through my account restrictions. He filed a complaint with our bank, claiming that his access to marital funds had been illegally terminated by someone who wasn't authorized to make such decisions. The bank's response was swift and decisive. After reviewing the account ownership, documentation, and signature cards, they confirmed that I had been the primary account holder for over 30 years, and that my restriction protocol was entirely legal. They also noted that Charles had never actually contributed deposits to most of the accounts he was claiming to control. The most unexpected development was how Charleston's business community began responding to the revelation about my professional activities. Instead of viewing my consulting practice as some kind of shocking secret, successful business leaders were expressing interest in my investment strategies and requesting consultations. I received calls from 3 bank presidents, 2 real estate developers, and the CEO of Charleston's largest technology firm, all asking about my availability for strategic financial consulting. Apparently, word about my 22% annual returns had spread beyond my female client network, and serious investors wanted to understand my methodology. The Charleston Business Journal requested an interview about my investment philosophy and the lessons other financial professionals could learn from my approach. The reporter, Jennifer Walsh, was particularly interested in how I had identified emerging trends before they became obvious to mainstream investors. "Mrs. Whitfield, your portfolio performance suggests that you've been consistently ahead of market trends," Jennifer noted during our phone interview. "What's your secret for identifying opportunities that other investors miss?" I explained my research methodology, which combined traditional financial analysis with careful observation of social and technological patterns. "Most investors focus on quarterly earnings and established market leaders," I told her. "I spend more time studying consumer behavior changes, regulatory trends, and emerging technologies that haven't yet been reflected in stock prices." The resulting article, titled "The Hidden Investment Genius of Charleston," positioned me as a brilliant financial strategist who had been operating below the radar while generating returns that would be impressive for any professional fund manager. Charles was mentioned only briefly as Mrs. Whitfield's husband, a local attorney. The professional recognition was gratifying, but the real satisfaction was watching Charles's attempt to shame me backfire so completely. Instead of being exposed as a fraud or a woman having a psychological crisis, I was being celebrated as a successful entrepreneur who had built an impressive business while maintaining a traditional lifestyle. Charles's narrative about my supposed incompetence was colliding with reality, and reality was winning decisively. By the second week after our dinner party revelation, the practical implications of our new financial arrangement were becoming clear to Charles in ways that no amount of denial could obscure. His platinum credit card had been declined at Ocean House Country Club, where he had tried to pay for lunch with his golf partners. His attempt to purchase a $3,000 bottle of wine at his favorite shop had been rejected when his credit card was refused. Most embarrassingly, his check for the country club's annual membership fee had bounced, resulting in a polite but firm letter about settling his account balance. Charles was experiencing, for the first time in his adult life, what it felt like to live within his actual means rather than his aspirational lifestyle. His law practice income of $180,000 per year was comfortable by most standards, but it was nowhere near sufficient to support the $340,000 annual spending that I had been quietly subsidizing for years. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Charles had built his identity around being a successful provider who could afford luxury goods and exclusive experiences. Discovering that he couldn't actually afford his own lifestyle was like discovering that his entire sense of self had been based on a lie. But the cruelest irony was that I was not just financially independent from Charles. I was financially superior to him in every measurable way. My investment portfolio generated more passive income in a typical month than his law practice generated in profit during a good quarter. My consulting business had higher profit margins and more prestigious clients than his decades-old legal practice. The woman he had been condescending to about financial matters for 42 years was not just competent with money. She was extraordinarily gifted at creating and managing wealth. And now, Charles was about to learn exactly what it felt like to be truly financially worthless compared to the woman he had been calling worthless for decades. 3 weeks after the dinner party that destroyed Charles's world, he made a decision that would prove to be his final and most catastrophic mistake. Unable to accept the reality of his financial dependence or the collapse of his social standing, Charles decided to deploy what he called his nuclear option, a scorched earth strategy designed to destroy my reputation so completely that I would be forced to return to our previous arrangement just to survive socially. The plan was revealed to me through a phone call from my client Rebecca Thompson, whose husband worked at the same country club where Charles played golf every Tuesday. "Maggie, I need to warn you about something," Rebecca said, her voice tight with concern. "Charles has been telling people at Ocean House that you're suffering from severe mental illness and that your claims about managing investments are elaborate, delusions caused by early-stage Alzheimer's disease." But Charles hadn't stopped at casual gossip. According to Rebecca's sources, he had hired a private investigator named Marcus Webb to build a case that my consulting business was actually an elaborate fraud scheme designed to hide marital assets during divorce proceedings. Webb was reportedly preparing a dossier that would be submitted to the South Carolina Attorney General's Office, the IRS, and the Securities and Exchange Commission. He's claiming that you've been running an unlicensed investment advisory service, manipulating client accounts and using sophisticated accounting tricks to inflate your apparent wealth, Rebecca continued. Marcus Webb specializes in financial fraud investigations, and Charles is paying him $50,000 to prove that you're either mentally incompetent or criminally deceptive. The irony of Charles spending $50,000 of my money to hire an investigator to prove that I was financially fraudulent was almost too perfect to believe. But the threat was real, and the potential consequences were serious. If Webb could create even a superficially convincing case that my business activities were illegitimate, it might be enough to freeze my assets during lengthy government investigations. Called Catherine Fleming immediately to discuss our response strategy. "This is actually excellent news," Catherine said after I explained Charles's latest tactic. "Marcus Webb is a competent investigator, which means his report will be thorough and professional. When he concludes that your business activities are completely legitimate and your financial documentation is impeccable, it will be much harder for Charles to continue claiming that you're defrauded or delusional." Catherine had anticipated this kind of escalation and had prepared accordingly. "We're going to let Webb conduct his investigation without interference," she explained. "In fact, we're going to cooperate fully and provide him with even more documentation than he requests. By the time he's finished, he'll have independently verified everything we've been claiming about your financial contributions and professional competence. But first, we needed to address the whisper campaign that Charles had launched about my supposed mental decline. Charles's strategy of questioning my mental competence was particularly insidious because it played into societal assumptions about aging women and their cognitive capabilities. At 70, I was exactly the demographic that people might be predisposed to view as potentially confused about complex financial matters, especially if a seemingly credible source like my husband was expressing concern. But Charles had made a critical error in choosing this line of attack. My client network included some of the most influential women in Charleston, many of whom had decades of experience dealing with men who tried to undermine female credibility by questioning mental capacity rather than engaging with substantive arguments. Dr. Virginia Hendricks, one of my clients who happened to be Charleston's most respected neurologist, offered to conduct a comprehensive cognitive assessment that would definitively establish my mental acuity. Maggie, I've been monitoring your analytical capabilities through our investment discussions for 3 years, she told me during our phone conversation. Your cognitive performance is not only normal for your age, it's exceptional by any standard. Dr. Hendricks arranged for me to undergo a full neuropsychological evaluation at the Medical University of South Carolina, including memory tests, executive function assessments, and cognitive processing evaluations. The results would be documented by independent medical professionals and would be admissible in any legal proceeding where my mental competence might be questioned. Meanwhile, Diana Foster coordinated a more subtle but equally effective response through Charleston's social networks. Instead of directly confronting Charles's claims about my mental state, she organized a series of investment education seminars where I would present sophisticated financial analysis to groups of successful business people. The first seminar was held at the Charleston Country Club with an audience that included bank presidents, real estate developers, and several members of the state legislature. I presented a detailed analysis of emerging market trends, cryptocurrency valuations, and artificial intelligence investment opportunities that demonstrated not only my cognitive sharpness, but also my deep expertise in cutting-edge financial strategies. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Senator Patricia Williams, who chaired the state's Economic Development Committee, approached me after the presentation with a request for private consultation about her personal investment portfolio. Mrs. Whitfield, your analysis of the renewable energy sector was brilliant, she said. I'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss some specific investment opportunities you mentioned. Word about my presentation spread quickly through Charleston's business community, making it increasingly difficult for anyone to believe Charles's claims about my supposed cognitive decline. The woman he was describing as mentally incompetent was being sought after by some of the state's most sophisticated investors for her strategic insights. Marcus Webb proved to be exactly the kind of professional investigator that Catherine had predicted. Thorough, methodical, and completely immune to Charles's emotional appeals for predetermined conclusions. Webb's first meeting was with me, and he approached the investigation with the analytical detachment of someone who had seen enough financial fraud cases to recognize both legitimate and illegitimate business activities. Mrs. Whitfield, I need to understand the scope and structure of your consulting practice, Webb began, settling into his chair in my home office with a tablet and recording device. Mr. Whitfield has alleged that your reported income and asset values are significantly inflated, possibly through illegal means. I'll need to review your client contracts, investment records, and tax filings going back at least 10 years. I had prepared for this moment for months. Every document Webb requested was immediately available, organized in clearly labeled files, and supported by independent verification from banks, brokers, and government agencies. My client contracts were legally sophisticated. My investment records were meticulously documented, and my tax filings were models of accurate reporting and conservative compliance. Webb spent 3 days in my office reviewing bank statements, brokerage records, client communications, and business expense documentation. He interviewed several of my clients by phone, verifying the scope of services I provided and the results I had generated for their portfolios. He even contacted my CPA, my attorney, and my business insurance provider to confirm the legitimacy of my professional operations. But the most devastating blow to Charles's narrative came when Webb reviewed our joint tax returns and discovered the pattern that Martin Brewster had already identified. My investment and consulting income had been clearly reported for over a decade, and Charles had been signing tax returns that explicitly documented my business activities and their financial results. "Mrs. Whitfield," Webb said during our final interview, "your husband has been signing tax returns that report your business income for years. Either he was aware of your consulting practice, or he was signing legal documents without reading them. Neither scenario supports his current claims about being deceived." Webb's investigation took 2 weeks, and his final report was a comprehensive vindication of everything I had claimed about my financial activities. He concluded that my consulting business was properly licensed, professionally operated, and generating legitimate income through documented client relationships. My investment portfolio was held through appropriate legal structures and had been built through traceable transactions using funds that were clearly my separate property. Most importantly, Webb's report included a detailed financial analysis that confirmed my claims about supporting Charles's lifestyle. Mr. Whitfield's personal expenses have exceeded his law practice income by an average of $160,000 annually over the past 5 years, Webb wrote. This deficit has been covered by transfers from investment accounts controlled by Mrs. Whitfield. When Charles received Webb's report, his reaction was swift and predictable. He accused Webb of being incompetent, biased, or possibly bribed. He demanded a second investigation by a different firm. He threatened to file complaints against Webb's professional licensing board, but the damage was done. An independent investigator, hired by Charles himself, had confirmed every aspect of my financial story and had documented the extent of Charles's dependence on my income. Any future legal proceedings would include Webb's report as evidence that my claims about our financial relationship were not only accurate but conservatively stated. While Webb was conducting his investigation, Charles's professional reputation was experiencing its own form of systematic destruction. The whisper campaign he had started about my supposed mental incompetence had prompted several of his law firm colleagues to examine his own recent performance more critically. What they discovered was troubling. Richard Morrison and David Hayes had been covering for Charles's declining capabilities for months, handling research that he was supposed to complete, managing client relationships that he was neglecting, and quietly correcting legal documents that contained increasingly frequent errors. The partners called a meeting to discuss Charles's future with the firm. According to Catherine Fleming's sources, the conversation was devastating for Charles's professional pride. His colleagues presented a detailed review of his recent work that revealed a pattern of missed deadlines, superficial legal research, and client complaints about his condescending attitude and outdated strategies. Charles has been coasting on his reputation for years, one partner reportedly said during the meeting. His legal research is sloppy, his client relations are deteriorating, and his billing hours have been declining steadily. We've been subsidizing his partnership because of his family connection to the firm's history, but that can't continue indefinitely. The firm's managing committee made a decision that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. They offered Charles an early retirement package that would reduce him to emeritus status with limited responsibilities and significantly reduced compensation. The alternative was a formal performance review that might result in his complete separation from the firm. Charles's response was characteristic. He blamed everyone except himself. He claimed that his partners were jealous of his success and reputation. He suggested that the firm's younger lawyers were conspiring against him because they resented his experience and wisdom. He even implied that his colleagues were being influenced by my manipulative behavior and my alleged mental health issues. But the most revealing aspect of Charles's reaction was his complete inability to acknowledge that his own performance might be the problem. Even when confronted with documented evidence of his professional decline, he insisted that external forces were responsible for his difficulties. The partners gave Charles 30 days to decide between voluntary retirement and formal performance review. Given the circumstances, retirement was the only option that would preserve any remnant of his professional dignity. the cumulative effect of Charles's various failed strategies was a social isolation that he had never experienced in his privileged life. The men who had once respected his opinions about business and finance were now aware that his apparent success had been built on his wife's hidden financial genius. The women who had tolerated his condescending lectures were now comparing notes about his patronizing behavior over the years. Most devastatingly, Charles's attempt to shame me through rumors about mental illness had backfired so completely that he was now viewed as a cruel husband who was willing to spread lies about his wife's cognitive capacity rather than admit his own financial incompetence. Patricia Morrison had become particularly vocal about Charles's behavior, sharing her observations. With anyone who would listen, "I've watched Charles Whitfield lecture women about financial matters for 20 years, she told a group at their monthly book club meeting. Now we know that he was essentially mansplaining investment strategies to the woman who was actually funding his entire lifestyle. It's pathetic and disgusting." The social media discussions about our situation had evolved into broader conversations about financial abuse, gender dynamics in marriage, and the ways that successful women were often expected to hide their achievements, to protect male egos. Charles had become a symbol of entitled masculine arrogance, while I was being celebrated as an example of quiet female competence, finally receiving recognition. Even more damaging to Charles's social standing was the growing awareness of how he had treated other women over the years. Stories emerged about his dismissive comments to female colleagues, his patronizing advice to successful businesswomen, and his general assumption that women were naturally inferior at complex decision-making. Linda Hayes had compiled a particularly devastating collection of Charles's quotes about women and money, shared during various social gatherings over the past decade. "Women are naturally more emotional about financial decisions," he had said at one dinner party. "They need strong male guidance to avoid making impulsive choices based on feelings rather than analysis." The irony was that Charles had been making emotional financial decisions for years, purchasing expensive cars, wine, and luxury goods based on his feelings about status and image, while I had been making analytical investment decisions based on careful research and disciplined strategy. Charles found himself increasingly excluded from social gatherings where he might encounter people who knew about our situation. Golf partners began finding excuses to play with other groups. Country club events that once featured Charles as a respected member now included whispered conversations about his dependence on his wife's money. The man who had built his identity around social status and professional respect was discovering what it felt like to be a pariah in the community where he had once been a leader. Facing professional retirement, social exile, and financial dependence, Charles made one last desperate attempt to regain control of our relationship. Unable to challenge my financial success through legal or professional channels, he decided to appeal to my emotions through a combination of manipulation, guilt, and threats. The campaign began with a series of letters that Charles left in strategic locations around our house, on my coffee maker, tucked into my reading chair, placed on my car dashboard. The letters were masterpieces of emotional manipulation, combining professions of love with subtle threats and attempts to make me feel guilty about destroying our marriage. "My dearest Maggie," one letter began, "I know that I haven't always expressed my appreciation for everything you do for our family. I've been thinking about our 42 years together, and I realize that I may have taken your contributions for granted. Can't we find a way to work through this difficult period without destroying everything we've built together?" The letters escalated over several days, becoming more desperate and manipulative. Charles wrote about his health concerns, his fear of being alone in his old age, and his regret about not recognizing my intelligence and capabilities sooner. He promised to change his behavior, to treat me as an equal partner, and to acknowledge my role in our financial success. But the most revealing letters were the ones where Charles's desperation overcame his strategic thinking. "Maggie, you have to understand that men my age don't adapt well to dramatic changes in their life circumstances," he wrote. The stress of this situation is affecting my health, my work performance, and my ability to think clearly. If you continue with this divorce process, you'll essentially be destroying a 73-year-old man who has nowhere else to turn. The emotional manipulation was sophisticated, but it was also fundamentally dishonest. Charles wasn't asking for reconciliation based on genuine remorse or changed understanding. He was asking me to resume the role of financial provider while allowing him to maintain the fiction that he was the family's breadwinner. When the letters failed to produce the desired response, Charles escalated to personal confrontations. He would appear in my home office while I was working, interrupting client calls and business meetings with dramatic speeches about love, forgiveness, and family loyalty. Maggie, we're both 70 years old, he said during one particularly theatrical performance. How many years do we have left together? Do you really want to spend our remaining time fighting in courtrooms and living in separate houses? Think about what we're throwing away. 4 decades of shared memories, experiences, and mutual support. The manipulation was transparent, but it was also desperate. Charles was a man who had never experienced genuine powerlessness, and his attempts to regain control were becoming increasingly frantic and irrational. But his final gambit was the most revealing of all. When emotional manipulation failed, Charles resorted to financial threats that exposed just how little he understood about our actual legal and financial situation. Maggie, you need to think carefully about what you're doing, he said during our last face-to-face conversation. If you persist with this divorce, I'll be forced to pursue every legal option available to protect my rights to marital property. You may think you're in control now, but I have resources and connections that you don't fully understand. I can make this process very expensive and very unpleasant for both of us. The threat was empty, and Charles knew it. But it was also a perfect summary of everything that was wrong with his understanding of our relationship. Even after weeks of evidence that I controlled our finances, managed our investments, and possessed far more sophisticated legal preparation than he did, Charles still believed that his resources and connections could somehow overcome the reality of my financial superiority. It was the final proof that Charles would never accept the truth about our relationship, never acknowledge my capabilities, and never treat me as anything other than a subordinate who had temporarily gotten out of line. That conversation convinced me that reconciliation was not only impossible, but undesirable. Charles had shown me exactly who he was, and I finally believed him. The time for gentle corrections and diplomatic negotiations was over. Charles was about to learn what it felt like when someone who actually controlled the resources decided to use them decisively. The morning after Charles's final threat, I made a series of phone calls that would permanently alter the balance of power in our relationship. The first call was to Catherine Fleming, informing her that I was ready to proceed with formal divorce proceedings without any further attempts at negotiation or reconciliation. I want you to file for divorce immediately, I told Catherine. And I want you to request temporary financial support from Charles to cover my legal expenses during the proceedings. Catherine's laughter was audible through the phone. Maggie, that's brilliant. Given his actual income versus his lifestyle expenses, requesting financial support from Charles will force him to confront the reality of his situation in the most direct way possible. The second call was to my accountant, instructing him to prepare a comprehensive financial statement that would be submitted as part of the divorce filing. This document would detail every asset, every income source, and every financial transaction that had contributed to our family's wealth over 4 decades. The third call was to Diana Foster, asking her to coordinate a meeting of my client network to discuss the transition of my consulting practice during the divorce proceedings. I want to make sure my clients understand that this personal situation won't affect my professional capabilities or availability, I explained. But the most important call was to Dr. Amanda Ross, my therapist, to discuss the psychological strategies I would need for the final phase of this confrontation. Charles is going to become desperate as he realizes that his threats are empty and his manipulation tactics aren't working, Dr. Ross warned. You need to be prepared for increasingly erratic behavior as his sense of control completely collapses. Dr. Ross was right. The next few weeks would test every aspect of my psychological preparation, as Charles discovered what it truly meant to be financially powerless in a relationship with someone who held all the cards. The student was about to become the teacher, and the lesson was going to be devastating. The Charleston County Family Court had seen plenty of contentious divorce cases, but the Whitfield proceedings became legendary for the sheer one-sidedness of the financial evidence. When Catherine Fleming filed our divorce petition in August 2024, the documentation filled 14 bankers' boxes and required a specialized forensic accountant to organize the exhibits. Judge Elizabeth Morrison opened the proceedings by reviewing the basic facts. This appears to be a divorce involving substantial marital assets and competing claims about financial contributions, she noted. I see that Mrs. Whitfield is requesting 85% of the marital estate based on her documented contributions. Charles's attorney immediately objected. Your Honor, Mrs. Whitfield's claims are vastly inflated. My client built this family's wealth through 42 years of successful legal practice. Catherine Fleming smiled with the confidence of someone holding a royal flush. Your Honor, we have documentation prepared by independent accountants and confirmed by a private investigator hired by Mr. Whitfield himself. The first day focused on establishing our respective incomes. Catherine presented tax returns and business, records that painted a devastating picture of Charles's actual economic productivity versus his lifestyle expenses. Our CPA testified that Charles's law practice had generated an average of $180,000 annually, while his personal expenses averaged $340,000 annually. The difference was consistently covered by investment returns and consulting fees generated by Mrs. Whitfield's business activities, Martin explained to the court. When Charles's attorney attempted to challenge my consulting income, Catherine introduced Marcus Webb's investigation report. Mr. Whitfield hired this investigator to prove his wife's business activities were fraudulent. Instead, Mr. Webb concluded that Mrs. Whitfield operates a sophisticated and completely legitimate financial consulting practice. But the most devastating moment came when Catherine presented Charles's vintage car collection as evidence of my financial contributions. Each vehicle had been purchased with traceable proceeds from my investments, cryptocurrency profits, renewable energy stock gains, technology sector returns. Charles took the witness stand to defend his version of our financial history, but his testimony quickly devolved into angry rants. She's been hiding money from me for decades, he insisted. Judge Morrison interrupted with obvious impatience. Mr. Whitfield, are you claiming you were unaware of the investment income reported on your joint tax returns? These documents bear your signature. Charles's answer revealed his willful ignorance. I trusted my wife to handle the paperwork. I was focused on the big picture. Strategic thinking requires delegating administrative details. So you signed legal documents without reading them? Judge Morrison pressed. Catherine didn't even need to cross-examine. Charles's own testimony established that he had been signing tax returns for years without understanding their contents while claiming to be our family's financial expert. The court's asset analysis took 3 days and exceeded even my optimistic projections. Judge Morrison appointed Dr. Sarah Martinez, a forensic economist, to trace every major asset's source and determine each spouse's relative contributions. Dr. Martinez's report was devastating for Charles. Mrs. Whitfield's investment activities generated approximately $16.8 million of the couple's $19.3 million in total assets. Mr. Whitfield's law practice contributed approximately $2.5 million, primarily during the early marriage years. She had traced the compound effect of my investment decisions over 4 decades, showing how early technology stock purchases funded later real estate investments, which generated cash flow for cryptocurrency positions, which provided capital for my consulting business expansion. Judge Morrison's asset division reflected the overwhelming evidence. I was awarded 87% of our marital assets, including both homes and all investment accounts. Charles received 13% of the marital estate, plus his law practice and personal possessions. More importantly, the court ordered Charles to pay me $85,000 in attorney's fees and $50,000 in expert witness costs. The financial irony was perfect. Charles would be paying my legal bills with money from assets that I had created. While I was experiencing triumph, Charles's situation was deteriorating comprehensively. His forced retirement from the law firm had been accompanied by whispers about declining competence and client complaints. Without access to my investment returns, he struggled to maintain even a modest lifestyle on his $60,000 annual pension. The vintage car collection that had been his pride was being sold piece by piece to cover living expenses. The wine cellar was being liquidated through auction houses. Even his country club membership was terminated due to unpaid dues. The most devastating blow was the publication of Marcus Webb's investigation report in a legal journal article about forensic accounting and divorce proceedings. The article used our case as an example of how traditional assumptions about male financial leadership could blind investigators to complex asset ownership patterns. It revealed that Charles had been completely unaware of 84% of our family's wealth while claiming to be the primary financial decision-maker. While divorce proceedings concluded, my consulting practice experienced unprecedented growth. The publicity had attracted attention from successful women across the Southeast who wanted sophisticated financial guidance that traditional firms weren't providing. My client base expanded from 38 to 127 women within 6 months, with assets under management growing to $340 million. I hired 2 associate consultants and opened a formal office in Charleston's financial district. The irony wasn't lost on me that Charles's attempt to destroy my reputation had instead provided the marketing boost that transformed my discreet practice into a prominent wealth management firm. Whitfield Investment Strategies became known as the premier financial services company for successful women. My success was featured in Forbes, Fortune, and the Wall Street Journal, with articles describing how I had built a multi-million-dollar portfolio while maintaining the appearance of a traditional housewife. The coverage positioned me as an example of hidden female financial talent the investment industry had been overlooking. The Charleston Business Council named me Entrepreneur of the Year for building a successful firm, attracting clients and capital from across the region. During my acceptance speech at the same country club where Charles had once lectured about wealth management, I thanked my former husband for providing motivation to stop hiding my capabilities. Sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is underestimating you so completely that you're forced to prove them wrong, I told Charleston's business elite. The psychological transformation accompanying my financial liberation was even more dramatic than business success. Working with Dr. Amanda Ross, I understood how profoundly my marriage had shaped my sense of self-worth. You spent 42 years making yourself small, so Charles could feel large, Dr. Ross explained. You became so skilled at hiding your capabilities that you almost forgot how extraordinary they were. After decades of downplaying my intelligence and deferring to Charles's preferences, I was learning to express myself without constantly calculating the impact on someone else's ego. My new lifestyle reflected this shift. Contemporary home decorated to my taste, social circle of intelligent women who valued genuine achievement, international travel for business and pleasure. 18 months after that dinner party confrontation, I was living an unimaginable life. My consulting firm occupied a prestigious office overlooking Charleston Harbor, with staff managing nearly $500 million in client assets. The last time I saw Charles was at a charity fundraiser where I attended as a major donor, and he attended, trying to maintain social connections despite reduced circumstances. He approached me looking older and more uncertain than ever. Less expensive suit, modest haircut, the general air of someone no longer confident about his social place. "Maggie, you look wonderful," he said, his voice carrying sadness and what might have been genuine admiration. "I've been reading about your business success. You've built something remarkable." I studied his face, looking for signs of the arrogance that had characterized our relationship. Instead, I saw genuine recognition of my capabilities combined with authentic regret. "Thank you, Charles. I'm enjoying the work and grateful for the opportunity to help other women achieve their financial goals." Charles nodded slowly, then surprised me. "I owe you an apology, Maggie. A real one, not the manipulative kind I used to give." He struggled with words difficult for a man who had never acknowledged being wrong about anything important. "I spent 42 years convincing myself I was supporting you when you were supporting me. I was too arrogant and insecure to see how brilliant you were, too afraid of my own inadequacies to admit you were more capable." The apology was more honest than anything Charles had said during our marriage, but it was 42 years too late, and couldn't change the fundamental reality that he had only learned to see my worth after losing access to its benefits. "I appreciate you saying that, Charles. I hope you're able to build a life that makes you genuinely happy, not just one that impresses other people." We parted cordially, two people who had shared 4 decades but never really known each other until it was too late for the knowledge to matter. As I walked away, I reflected on the journey from invisible wife to recognized leader. Charles had called me worthless without him, and in trying to prove that claim, I had discovered something far more valuable than his approval. My worth was not dependent on anyone else's recognition. The woman who had spent 42 years pretending to need financial protection had become someone providing financial security for over 100 successful women. The wife dismissed as financially incompetent had built a business setting new standards for investment performance. Most importantly, I had learned that the most powerful thing you can do when someone underestimates you is not to prove them wrong, but to prove yourself right. At 70 years old, I was finally living the life I should have been living all along. Honest, successful, and completely, authentically myself. And Charles? He finally learned what it truly meant to be worthless, without someone else's money. The difference was that I had earned my worth, while he had simply been spending mine. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.